This video deals with the occurrence of what is called parallelism in poetry. Now, for a long time, there was a discussion of what exactly constituted Hebrew poetry because it doesn't really conform to the norms of, say, European poetry or classical poetry, Greek and Roman. Doesn't have rhyme. It's questionable whether it really has any meter, more on that later. And so in the 18th century, a scholar named Robert Louth realized that there was one feature which is rather common in Hebrew poetry, although again, it is not entirely sure that it occurs in all Hebrew poetry, and that is what is called parallelism. That is where you have two cola or two lines that are in some way connected to one another. For example, what is called synonymous parallelism. That is where you have two lines that basically say pretty much the same thing in two different ways. So, the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it. In this case, the earth, haaretz, is in parallel to tevel, the world. All who live in it, melo'ah, is parallel to yoshivei va. And so one does not look for in these lines different ideas, but rather a way of saying the same thing with some kind of variation. Another example where you actually have sort of three kola that do that. You have turned my mourning into dancing. You have taken off my sackcloth and clothed me with joy. In this case, the three verbs you have turned, you have taken off, and you have clothed me are in parallel with my mourning into dancing, my sackcloth with joy. It's three ways of saying something very similar. Another category that Louth recognized was what he called antithetic parallelism. That is where, in successive lines, things are contrasted, or the opposite is said, and yet they bear a very close relationship to one another in the successive lines. So in Psalm 7:10 in Hebrew, "Oh, let the evil of the wicked" is contrasted with the righteous. "Come to an end" is contrasted with establish or begin or start something. So a contrast here is being made, and yet there is a close relationship with the pattern of the verse of the kola. In another example, "You deliver a humble people, the haughty eyes you bring down." The humble people and haughty eyes are contrasted with one another. Deliver and bring down are contrasted. Another kind of parallelism that Louth labeled was what is called synthetic or formal parallelism, where the meaning of the two lines is not really either the same or the opposite, but rather the second line continues on to introduce a completion or another thought. So, for example, from the rising of the sun to its setting, the name of the Lord is to be praised. You can see that they're neither synonymous nor antithetic. Rather, one simply continues on to add something to the entire thought. The idea is that perhaps there is some kind of parallel rhythm here, parallel number of stresses, etc., but not a very obvious parallelism. A number of people kind of question whether, in fact, this is true parallelism. Another example might be the wicked draw the sword and bend their bows, and then what follows is the reason for drawing the sword and bending the bows: to bring down the poor and needy, to kill those who walk uprightly. In this case, to bring down the poor and needy and to kill those who walk uprightly is involves two parallel cola, but they are not necessarily parallel to the first line in the verse. Finally, there is something Lowth recognizes what might be called mixed parallelism. Here, the first two lines are parallel to one another. They're synonymous, but the third line is in a contrasting or antithetic relationship. God gives the desolate a home to live in. He leads out the prisoners to prosperity. This is sort of saying something very similar. And then that whole thing is contrasted to, but the rebellious live in a parched land. Since Lowth, there has been a lot of analysis of Hebrew poetry, especially in the last few decades. And there are new developments. And it is sort of recognized that it is hard to pin down an exact formula, but rather this parallelism involves some kind of dynamic movement from one verset or part of a verse to the next. And that movement is of heightening, intensification, of focusing, specification, making something concrete, dramaticizing it. There is some kind of movement, some kind of modification in the second, and then how many versets follow, to sort of strengthen, heighten, empower what is stated in the first line. And the sense is of theme and variation. Just a couple of examples. In Job, we have, what is man that he should be guiltless, that he should be in the right, he born of woman. The theory here is that the second line emphasizes frailty. Jeremiah 31:21, return, O virgin Israel, return to these your cities. The first term is parallel, return, but the second, O virgin Israel, these your cities, extends the thought. Now, I am going to just sort of show some of these examples, and we're not going to go into them in depth, but rather I will leave it to you if you are so interested. It is probably enough for the work that you are going to be doing to use Lowth's categories at the beginning. And we will look at other characteristics of Hebrew poetry in another video.